The stench of damp straw and rusted iron filled the air where light dared not enter. Somewhere beneath the echoing corridors of a forgotten castle, a child whimpered behind bars too small for his growing frame. He was born under banners of gold and velvet, but his crown was stolen before he ever learned to speak. The walls around him sweated with age, as though the stones themselves pitied his silent agony. Each morning, a guard slid a bowl of cold gruel through the bars without looking at the boy's face. The years melted together, days of hunger, nights of hallucinations, seasons marked only by the dying of candlelight. No one in the kingdom spoke his name anymore, as if erasing him might cleanse their conscience. Above the dungeon, courtiers feasted and gossiped about omens, pretending the ghost of the child was only rumor. The king, his own blood and father, had ordered the boy's imprisonment for a prophecy whispered by a trembling priest. The son shall devour the father's throne, the priest had warned, and fear did what reason could not. So the child was taken at dawn, his cries muffled beneath the hymn of obedience. The mother screamed as soldiers dragged her son away, her voice vanishing into the clamor of the court. She was told he had died of fever, and a sealed coffin was shown to her, empty within. Meanwhile, the boy grew in the shadows, bones thin as reed, eyes too wide for innocence. He learned to count the footsteps of guards, to recognize who brought food and who brought silence. In time, he forgot the sound of music, but remembered the rhythm of dripping water from the ceiling. He would speak to spiders for company, naming them after people he once knew but could not picture anymore. His hair grew long and matted, his skin pale as candle wax, his words slurred by isolation. Sometimes he believed the whispers through the wall were angels, sometimes he thought they were his future self. Years later, a new servant arrived, one too young to know the story and too curious to ignore the whispers. One night, he followed the faint sound of breathing beneath the floorboards and found the cage no one spoke of. Inside, a boy stared back with hollow eyes, neither feral nor human, but something in between. The servant froze, unsure if the creature before him was alive or a warning from God. He fled in terror, spreading rumors of a cursed prince locked beneath the throne room. The tale reached the ears of nobles who had long forgotten their guilt but not their fear. Some demanded the chamber be sealed forever, others insisted it was merely superstition from the lower servants. But a few remembered the prophecy, and the king's trembling hands the day it was fulfilled. For as the monarch aged, his mind decayed, haunted by dreams of a voice calling him, Father. Each night, he woke drenched in sweat, hearing chains rattle somewhere deep beneath his own bedchamber. He would shout orders to burn the lower halls, yet no one dared touch the royal dungeons. To question what lay below was to invite death, the kind that came quietly, without trial or witness. And so the boy remained, half forgotten, half remembered, the kingdom's darkest secret breathing in the dark. Historians would later debate whether the story was myth or madness, but the record spoke little and trembled much. All that survived were fragments, a torn royal decree, a rusted cage, and a child's carved initials in stone. 10 years passed before anyone dared open that door again, and by then, it was too late for mercy. The sight they found within would haunt even the cruelest of men, for innocence had turned into something unrecognizable. It was no longer the story of a prince, it was the birth of a legend soaked in fear. And that was only the beginning of the horror that would consume an entire dynasty. Power in the kingdom had always been a performance, and fear was the stage upon which it danced. The king who caged his son ruled through trembling silence, a man devoured by his own suspicions. He trusted no counselor, no priest, no wife, only the echo of his own paranoid thoughts. Every whisper became treason, every glance a conspiracy waiting to be punished by the blade. He had once been celebrated as a reformer, a monarch of vision and justice, adored by nobles and peasants alike. But the prophecy had unmade him, turning reason into rot and love into loathing. His court became a theater of masks, where loyalty was rehearsed daily and betrayal ended in blood. At banquets, he smiled through cracked lips, feigning calm while his fingers twitched near his dagger's hilt. Even the musicians played in fear, uncertain which note might summon the king's wrath. Behind the silk curtains, servants whispered of the Iron Prince, the child imprisoned beneath the palace. To mention him aloud was blasphemy, yet his shadow hung over every chamber. The queen had withered into silence, her eyes hollowed by years of pretending her womb had birthed only death. Those who pitied her vanished within days, their names struck from the castle's records as if they never breathed. The king began holding secret rituals at midnight, guided by monks who promised to cleanse his cursed bloodline. He bathed his hands in animal blood, chanting for protection from the child he had entombed. The priests told him sacrifice would appease heaven, but his nightmares only deepened. In his dreams, he saw the boy as a grown man, pale, voiceless, dragging chains through the royal chamber. He woke screaming, accusing his advisors of treachery, demanding they prove their loyalty through acts of cruelty. Some cut off their own fingers to please him, others offered their daughters to his twisted mercy. The line between devotion and madness blurred until even the innocent learned to sin for survival. His soldiers began locking up townspeople for imagined insults, branding them as servants of the caged heir. Children disappeared from villages, rumored to be taken for the king's cleansing rituals. The kingdom lived in dread of its ruler's moods, which changed with the phases of the moon. When rage possessed him, he ordered the castle torches extinguished, a night of pure darkness and screams. He would pace the throne room barefoot, muttering prayers to gods no one recognized. His reflection terrified him, mirrors were smashed, portraits burned, names forbidden. He ordered the royal painter executed for depicting a boy with his eyes. Each new cruelty became an offering to the god of paranoia that ruled his heart. He trusted only the monk who had first whispered the prophecy, a pale man with ink-stained hands and dead eyes. This monk convinced him that to destroy evil, he must first understand it, by watching it suffer. So the king demanded reports from the dungeon, the boy's silence, his trembling, his refusal to die. They said the child had begun to hum tuneless melodies, as though mocking his father's prayers. The king interpreted it as sorcery, a curse echoing from the cage below. He ordered the air vents sealed, so not even sound could reach the light above. But silence did not bring peace, it only fed his imagination, breeding visions too hideous to name. He began to believe the entire court was conspiring to free the boy, even as famine spread outside his walls. The treasury emptied into weapons, spies, and bribes, anything to smother a child who no longer spoke. The nobles started plotting in secret, terrified not of rebellion, but of what their ruler had become. For when a king fears his own blood, the entire kingdom becomes the cage. And beneath the floorboards of that haunted palace, the breathing of the forgotten prince never stopped. It pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the throne, a rhythm of vengeance waiting for its hour. Soon, the walls themselves would remember the screams that built them, and the prophecy would return to claim its truth. It began with a storm that refused to end, a rain so heavy it sounded like fists pounding on the roof of heaven. Thunder rolled over the fortress like drums of judgment, and the torches along the battlements hissed and died. That night, the king descended into the dungeon for the first time in 10 years, clutching a lantern in his trembling faith. He claimed he wanted to see the curse with his own eyes, to prove to himself that the boy still lived. Guards led him through the dripping corridors, where mold crept like veins along the walls and rats scattered from his shadow. Each step echoed like a heartbeat, every sound magnified into guilt, until even silence began to scream. At last, they reached the chamber sealed by rust and prayer, the air heavy with decay and forgotten cries. When the iron door creaked open, the stench of rot and memory spilled into the corridor like a ghost. Inside, something moved, not with the grace of a child, but with the broken rhythm of something half-human, half-starved. The prince had grown, but not like other men, his limbs were thin, his eyes sunken, his skin pale as moonlight. His hair fell in matted ropes, his nails blackened like claws, his voice cracked by years of silence. He did not flinch from the light, he only stared, blinking slowly, as if unsure the vision was real. The king stepped closer, raising his lantern, and saw the boy's lips twist into a faint, almost knowing smile. That smile broke whatever remained of his sanity. It was not innocence, but recognition. The boy whispered a word, hoarse, barely human, yet every man present swore it sounded like "father." The king staggered backward, dropping the lantern, flames licking the moldy floor as shadows danced on stone. Guards rushed to contain the fire, but the king shouted for them to stop, to let it burn, to purify the curse. He screamed that the child was possessed, that he must be purged by holy fire before the prophecy consumed them all. The captain hesitated. To kill royal blood was treason, but hesitation itself had become a crime in this court. The king drew his own sword, its edge trembling as he pointed it toward the cage. The prince laughed then, softly, a sound more chilling than any scream, like a hymn sung in reverse. It was a sound that carried the weight of 10 years of solitude, pain, and forgotten humanity. The king swung his blade against the bars, striking sparks that lit the boy's hollow face in flashes of horror. The steel shattered on the third blow, and the echo of it filled the hall like a funeral bell. The boy did not move, he simply watched as the king fell to his knees, clutching the broken sword like a cross. In that moment, thunder split the ceiling stone, and rain poured through the cracks like divine judgment. Flames sputtered, steam rose, and the dungeon filled with the choking smell of burning oil and wet ashes. The guards dragged the king out by force, his screams mingling with the thunder, "Seal him! Seal the demon!" The door was locked again, this time with molten lead and the king's personal seal pressed into the metal. For 3 days, the castle reeked of smoke and madness. The priests claimed the storm was heaven's approval. But whispers spread that the boy had not died, that when the door was sealed, they heard breathing within. Some said his shadow appeared under the torchlight even when no flame burned. Others swore that at night, the sound of chains could be heard under the throne room, dragging closer each day. The king began to see the boy's face reflected in mirrors, in wine, even in his own son's portrait. He forbade anyone to speak of the cage again, but silence only deepened the terror. One night, the captain of the guard vanished, the same man who had led the king below. His armor was found days later near the dungeon door, bent inward as if crushed by unseen hands. The monks insisted the curse had awakened, that the child was no longer human but the spirit of vengeance itself. The king's paranoia reached its peak, he ordered the chapel sealed, fearing even God had turned against him. He slept with candles burning and swords by his bed, whispering prayers to saints that no longer answered. Every night, he heard the same voice, hoarse, calm, patient, whispering from beneath the floor, "You remember me." And every dawn, he awoke to find his candlelight dimmed, his windows open, his crown on the floor. The cage had not only trapped a child, it had trapped the soul of a kingdom that would never be free again. The boy's punishment had become the empire's curse, and its echoes were just beginning to rise. The palace had become a machine of whispers, gears turning through secrets, oiled by blood and fear. Every corridor hummed with rumors of the child beneath the floor, a legend that breathed in servants' dreams. The courtiers smiled by day but prayed by night, terrified that the cage would one day open itself. Letters vanished before reaching their destinations, messengers were found floating in wells with tongues cut out. Behind silk tapestries, spies listened for forbidden names, recording them in ink made from burned confession scrolls. No one trusted anyone, brothers betrayed brothers, wives poisoned husbands, and loyalty was auctioned like a relic. The king's council, once filled with scholars and nobles, had transformed into a congregation of terrified survivors. They met in dimly lit chambers, eyes darting like hunted animals, debating how to serve madness without dying from it. Each man spoke in half-truths, fearing his words might echo down the walls to the cage below. The monk who had foretold the prophecy now sat at the king's right hand, pale as parchment, hollow-eyed and revered. He claimed that the boy's survival proved the prophecy divine, that God himself demanded continued suffering. To challenge his voice was heresy, punishable by mutilation, and no one dared speak reason anymore. He whispered that the prince's endurance was demonic, that the boy's existence poisoned the air itself. Soon, the king began purging his bloodline, declaring cousins, nephews, and distant kin to be tainted by the curse. Executions became spectacles again, noblemen hung upside down in the square, their families forced to watch. The queen, long a ghost in her own chambers, was accused of harboring sympathy for her imprisoned son. At dawn, she was dragged through the court in a white gown, her hair unbound, her wrists bound with rosary chains. The king kissed her forehead and ordered her confined to a convent, where no mirrors were allowed. After that day, he was never seen smiling again, though his laughter often echoed through empty halls. At the same time, the lower clergy began to doubt the monk's visions, whispering that he too was cursed. A bishop vanished during mass, his robe found hanging from the bell tower, his bones crushed like wax. It was said the king had ordered the execution to silence divine opposition. But the people outside the palace walls had begun to whisper louder than the courtiers inside. Peasants claimed to see lights beneath the castle at night, flickering as though the earth itself was breathing. Fishermen swore they heard sobbing beneath the bridge, where water ran red during storms. The nobles dismissed it as peasant hysteria, until the royal treasurer's son was found dead near the dungeon gate. His skin was pale blue, his eyes open, his mouth frozen in a scream, and the iron seal had been disturbed. The court's silence fractured, alliances shifted like sand under a dying sun. Two powerful lords began plotting to remove the king, each pretending loyalty while sharpening daggers behind their smiles. Their plan was to blame the monk, to claim he had bewitched the king with false visions and dark rites. They forged documents, bribed guards, and promised to liberate the kingdom from divine tyranny. But the monk was listening, he had ears in every corridor, shadows that whispered even when no lips moved. The night before the coup, both lords were found in their chambers, their throats slit and eyes burned to ash. The message was written in their blood upon the floor, the heir hears everything. From that moment, terror no longer came from the king's wrath, it came from beneath his throne. Ministers resigned, generals fled, and even the castle's dogs refused to approach the lower halls. When the king walked through his corridors, he was followed not by guards, but by silence. He began speaking only to portraits, convinced that painted ancestors could protect him better than living men. The monk encouraged his isolation, claiming solitude was holy and that betrayal bred in company. Soon, the royal court became a mausoleum, laughter outlawed, music forbidden, every candle burning down to smoke. Even the sun seemed reluctant to touch the castle's towers, as though daylight feared contamination. Those who remained within its walls whispered that power had become a disease, invisible, contagious, terminal. The child in the cage was no longer merely a prisoner, he had become the pulse of the kingdom's dread. The court lived for the sound of chains, proof that the horror still slept, that the prophecy was not yet fulfilled. But one night, the chains stopped. No sound, no breath, no whisper came from below, and that silence was more terrifying than any scream. In that stillness, the courtiers realized that the true ruler of the realm might no longer be the man on the throne. And as the monk smiled through candlelight, the court understood that whatever was beneath the floor had finally awakened. Outside the palace walls, the kingdom festered beneath the weight of superstition and fear. The peasants spoke of omens in the sky, red moons, birds flying backward, cattle born without eyes. Every misfortune, every plague, every failed harvest was blamed on the caged prince beneath the castle. Mothers told their children to pray before sleeping, lest the boy in the dark whisper their names at night. Village priests used his story to frighten sinners into confession, describing him as half demon, half angel, punished for defying heaven. In marketplaces, sellers crossed themselves whenever the royal crest appeared, murmuring blessings to ward off the king's curse. Songs of the Iron Child spread through taverns, sung in hushed voices between drinks and fearful glances. The lyrics told of innocence chained by power, of a child who would one day rise to devour his father's crown. Commoners claimed to see the prince in dreams, pale, silent, standing behind their reflection in the river's water. Merchants refused to travel near the capital after dusk, fearing the cursed winds that carried whispers from the royal dungeon. Even the clergy fractured in belief, half saw the boy as punishment from God, the other half as divine vengeance upon tyranny. In temples, priests debated whether evil could be born from love or whether love itself had birthed the evil. One sect began worshipping the imprisoned child as a holy martyr, the chained saint who bears the sins of kings. They wore veils of iron thread and branded their wrists with his initials, claiming visions of his suffering brought them closer to truth. The church denounced them as heretics, but their followers grew by the thousands, spreading through cities like a fever of faith. Peasants gathered near the castle gates at night, lighting candles for the forgotten prince, whispering prayers for his release. The king, hearing of these gatherings, ordered soldiers to burn the fields where the pilgrims knelt. He called them traitors, but secretly, their faith terrified him, for faith was the one weapon he could not control. The people no longer feared his crown, they feared his silence. Taxes went unpaid, banners were torn down, and old families began funding rebel preachers in secret. The court scribes were ordered to erase all records of the boy's existence, but the ink refused to vanish completely. Even when the parchment was burned, faint letters reappeared in the ashes, like a curse that refused to die. Historians in distant lands began writing of the mad king of the cage, a tale spreading faster than his armies could silence it. Traders from foreign ports carried stories of a monarch haunted by his own son, a ruler cursed by his reflection. Diplomats began avoiding his court, citing sickness, though all knew the disease was not of the body. Inside the palace, superstition became ritual. Each dawn, guards poured holy water into the cracks of the dungeon floor. At dusk, they hammered iron nails into the doors, whispering prayers in languages they didn't understand. Some swore they felt the ground tremble beneath their boots, as if the earth itself strained to breathe. When a famine struck the southern provinces, the monks declared it divine punishment for the boy's continued suffering. They urged the king to end the curse by spilling the last drop of royal blood. But the king refused, claiming that as long as the boy lived, heaven still favored his reign. That single lie kept the entire realm chained to madness. Fathers sacrificed livestock to appease the ghost of the prince, mothers carved symbols into their children's cribs to keep him away. Old men whispered that even death avoided the castle, afraid to claim what had already been claimed by horror. The legend had escaped its walls, it became scripture, folklore, and rebellion all at once. In distant monasteries, scribes painted illuminated manuscripts depicting the crown of chains, a divine child bound by cruelty. The drawings showed him not as a monster but as a savior, pale, thin, with a light burning from within his chest. These images spread among peasants like wildfire, transforming pity into belief, and belief into dangerous hope. The people began to murmur that one day, the boy would return, not as flesh, but as judgment. For the first time, the throne itself began to feel fragile, trembling beneath the weight of faith and fear combined. And while the king grew thinner and madder with each sleepless night, the boy below was no longer just his sin, he had become his people's god. It began with a single scream from the western wing, the kind that cuts through stone like a blade. The servants rushed toward the noise but found only silence and a puddle of blood that led nowhere. By dawn, 3 more attendants had vanished, their names scratched from the palace registry before noon. The king called it treason, the monks called it cleansing, and the court called it the beginning of the end. Storms gathered over the capital again, black clouds circling the castle as if nature itself were watching the drama unfold. The people below whispered that the cage had opened, that the prince had finally risen from the dark. Inside the throne room, the king sat slumped, his crown askew, muttering verses that no scripture recognized. He refused food, refused light, and spoke to the empty air as though bargaining with unseen guests. When the monk entered to deliver his prayers, the king asked if the devil's child could truly die twice. The monk smiled faintly, saying, "Majesty, some cages were never meant to contain what was divine." That night, the king ordered the dungeon unsealed again, determined to confront his greatest fear before death found him first. The guards obeyed with shaking hands, praying quietly as molten lead was chipped from the ancient iron door. The moment it cracked open, a gust of cold air swept through the corridor, not the chill of death, but of something awake. Lanterns flickered out one by one, leaving only the trembling light of the king's torch. He stepped inside alone, ignoring the guard's pleas, the monk's chants, and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his skull. The chamber looked different now, the straw undisturbed, the air too still, the chains lying coiled like shed skin. The cage door hung open. Inside, nothing but dust, claw marks, and a single crude crown made from rat bones. The king collapsed to his knees, whispering the boy's name for the first time in years, but the walls only echoed it back in mockery. Behind him, the torchlight shuddered, something moved, too slow, too soft, like breath on the back of his neck. He turned, and there in the doorway stood a shape, frail, bent, barefoot, eyes glimmering with reflected flame. It said nothing, only stared, its face half in shadow, half in remembrance. The king staggered backward, whispering prayers that turned to sobs, dropping the torch into the straw. Fire erupted instantly, crawling up the walls like a living thing, devouring the darkness that had fed the secret for a decade. The guards fled, but the monk stayed, frozen in awe, chanting that the prophecy had been fulfilled. The flames consumed everything, iron, stone, bones, screams, yet in the roar of fire, a child's voice was heard laughing. By morning, half the castle was gone, a blackened skeleton against the grey sky, still smoking from the night's purge. The king was found near the throne, his eyes open, his crown melted into the flesh of his skull. Some said he had burned with the boy, others swore they saw two shadows escape into the fog before dawn. The monk disappeared, his robes discovered near the chapel, the walls scrawled with verses written in ash and blood. The Queen's convent received a message the next day, and signed, sealed with wax shaped like a small handprint. Inside were two words, "He's free." Panic spread faster than plague, priests demanded exorcisms, nobles fled the capital, and soldiers deserted their posts by the hundreds. For the first time in years, the common people approached the castle not with fear, but with torches of their own. They stormed the ruins, chanting the prince's name, believing the fire had purified the throne for him to return. When they found no body, their faith turned to fury. They tore down the royal banners, melted the statues, and proclaimed the kingdom cleansed of false kings. By dusk, the royal line had ended, and the throne room stood empty, still echoing with the sound of chains. But as night fell, the ruins glowed faintly, not from fire, but from something pulsing deep beneath the ground. Miners who later dug under the ashes claimed they heard breathing through the earth, slow and deliberate, like something sleeping again. The boy was gone, yet not gone, his presence woven into the stone, his silence louder than screams. That night, the rain returned, washing the soot from the broken walls, but no one dared rebuild. The kingdom had witnessed the prophecy fulfilled, not in words or deeds, but in the unmaking of its own soul. And though years would pass, the people would still say the wind that howled through the ruins carried the prince's laughter. It was the sound of vengeance satisfied, but never complete, a storm that had merely paused to breathe. The ashes of the castle cooled slowly, like the dying embers of a curse too proud to fade. For weeks, no one entered the ruins, birds avoided the towers, and dogs howled when passing by. The peasants called it the kingdom without a heart, for even the soil seemed afraid to bear life again. The monarchy had ended overnight, leaving behind only ghosts, stories, and the uneasy weight of silence. When scavengers finally dared to search the wreckage, they found melted crowns fused to bones and shattered chalices buried in soot. Among them lay fragments of the iron cage, warped by heat yet still intact, as though defying the fire itself. One piece was carved with a mark no one could explain, a small handprint pressed into the metal from inside. Chroniclers were sent by distant kingdoms to record what had happened, but none agreed on what they saw. Some claimed the fire had been divine punishment for the king's sins. Others whispered that the boy had become something else entirely, not human, not ghost, but retribution made flesh. The few surviving monks described hearing a child's laughter echoing through the catacombs days after the blaze. They fled before finishing their confessions, leaving their quills mid-stroke, their inkpots overturned like spilled guilt. When the Queen's convent received word of the king's death, she ordered no mourning, only prayer. Those who attended her said she smiled for the first time in years, whispering, "At last, he can breathe." But her peace was brief. 3 nights later, she was found lifeless in her cell, her hands clutching a charred piece of straw. The abbess swore it smelled of smoke and iron, though the convent had not seen fire in decades. By the year's end, the royal family's name was struck from every record, its sigil banned, its lands divided. New rulers rose from the chaos, each claiming divine favor, but their crowns felt lighter, hollow with inherited fear. The memory of the caged prince became political poison. To mention him was to invite whispers of rebellion. Still, his legend refused to die. Poets spoke of him as the boy beneath the throne, a symbol of suffering and divine judgment. Villagers built small shrines from rusted chains, leaving bread and milk for the restless spirit of innocence betrayed. Children who cried at night were told to listen. If they heard soft breathing under their bed, they should pray for mercy. In the capital's ruins, a strange phenomenon began. Plants grew from the scorched earth, black-petaled and metallic. Scholars studied them in awe, calling them iron lilies, claiming they absorbed sorrow from the soil. When pressed, the locals would only say, "That's where the boy sleeps now." Centuries later, travelers still spoke of strange sounds at night, the clink of chains, the echo of distant humming. Each generation added its own verse to the story, reshaping horror into parable, parable into myth. Historians debated whether the prince had ever truly existed or if he was an allegory for power devouring its own blood. But deep in the archives, one brittle parchment told otherwise, a royal decree signed by a trembling hand. It ordered silence about the matter of the child under penalty of death, sealed with a melted crest. The wax bore the same handprint found on the cage. This fragment became the kingdom's most forbidden relic, locked in a monastery vault guarded by monks who never spoke. Even foreign scholars who glimpsed it confessed to hearing faint breathing when they read the final line aloud. And that line, barely legible, read, "He is still watching." The legend began to shift again, from victim to witness, from prisoner to judge. Writers described the Iron Prince as an eternal observer of all rulers who abused their thrones. Kings who broke oaths or spilled innocent blood would dream of him, pale, silent, watching from behind invisible bars. Empires that ignored mercy eventually fell to famine, plague, or rebellion, as if cursed by the same unseen hand. The boy had become history's conscience, the embodiment of every cruelty a crown dared to forget. And though the ruins of his father's castle turned to dust, the story outlived marble, ink, and time itself. For every ruler who heard it shivered, wondering whether the sound in their halls was merely the wind, or a child breathing again beneath their throne. Centuries later, the story of the boy in the cage lingered like smoke that refused to vanish after the fire. No one could prove it had happened, yet every ruin, every whisper of tyranny, seemed to breathe his name. In the archives of crumbling kingdoms, fragments of parchment spoke of a forgotten dynasty and its devoured heart. Historians argued that it was legend, a metaphor for the madness of power and the corruption of kings. But legends do not leave fingerprints burned into iron. In remote museums, relics surfaced, a melted crown, a rusted cage hinge, and a bone carved with initials only royal blood would know. Scholars debated their authenticity while tourists stared, feeling a chill none could explain. Some said it was the draft from old stones, others swore it was breathing. Philosophers reinterpreted the tale as an eternal warning, that cruelty breeds ghosts, and guilt becomes inheritance. Modern rulers quoted it in speeches, declaring themselves protectors of children, of innocence, of truth. But in their palaces, marble floors still echoed too deeply, as though hollow beneath. In one capital, workers restoring an ancient cathedral uncovered a small chamber behind the altar. Inside lay a rusted chain and a child's footprint pressed into the stone, centuries old, perfectly preserved. The lead archaeologist refused to stay another night in the city, claiming he heard someone humming behind the walls. The world moved on, yet the story returned whenever power became too cruel, too proud, too blind. Every generation found itself haunted by the same moral question: how far would fear go to protect itself? The cage was no longer a prison of iron, it had become a symbol of human nature's darkest instinct. To confine what threatens us, even if it is our own blood. To silence innocence before it can speak truth. And to call it justice while it screams. The boy had ceased to be a person long ago, he was now a mirror held to the soul of every throne. Empires rose and fell, kings crowned and dethroned, yet his silence endured, an unspoken judgment echoing through centuries. In paintings, he appeared as a pale child with closed eyes and a faint smile, holding a broken chain. In literature, he became the nameless heir, the ghost of conscience that no history could bury. Even in modern times, his image resurfaced in cinema and art, a cage glowing faintly in darkness, a heartbeat beneath it. And people still ask the same question the king never answered, was the prophecy real, or did fear make it so? Perhaps the curse was not divine at all, but human, born of pride, guilt, and the hunger to control what we cannot. Perhaps the child was never the monster. Perhaps it was the crown. The ruins of the old palace still stand, overgrown by vines and silence, visited only by wind and memory. Those who listen closely at night swear they can hear faint breathing under the earth, slow, patient, alive. Not vengeful. Not tormented. Merely waiting. Waiting for another age of kings to rise, for another prophecy to be believed. And when it does, when fear once again outweighs love, the iron will sing again. The story will return, because cruelty always does, wrapped in robes, crowned in gold, justified by faith. And somewhere beneath its foundation, a child will whisper to the dark, "You never learned." The tale of the royal child who was locked in a cage for 10 years is not just history. It is a mirror of power's oldest sin, and its reflection still stares back at us.